Did you know that entire black towns were drowned under the lakes where families vacation today? Right now, as you're watching this video, there are churches, schools, homes, and entire communities lying beneath the water of some of America's most popular recreational lakes. But here's what they don't tell you in the tourism brochures. These weren't empty lands that got flooded. These were thriving black communities, built by people who had just escaped the horrors of slavery, who had created something beautiful, something independent, something that represented hope and prosperity. And then they were gone, not by accident, not by natural disaster, but by design. See, after the Civil War ended in 1865, something incredible happened. 4 million newly freed black Americans didn't just sit around waiting for handouts or hoping for acceptance. They got to work. They bought land, actual land, sometimes the very plantations where they had been enslaved. They built schools when they were denied education. They opened businesses when they were banned from white establishments. They created entire towns where black children could grow up seeing black doctors, black teachers, black shop owners, black leaders. These communities weren't just surviving, they were thriving. We're talking about places where black families accumulated generational wealth, where literacy rates soared, where innovation flourished. Places like Oscarville, Georgia, where black families owned lakefront property that would be worth millions today. Places like Seneca Village in Manhattan, where black New Yorkers owned land and had the right to vote decades before most black Americans elsewhere. But here's the thing about America. It has never been comfortable with black prosperity, never been comfortable with black independence. And so, systematically, methodically, these communities were targeted for destruction. Sometimes it was racial violence, masked mobs burning down entire neighborhoods, forcing families to flee in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Sometimes it was government projects, dams that needed to be built, reservoirs that needed to be filled, parks that needed to be created. And somehow, it was always black communities that stood in the way of progress. Today, millions of Americans swim, boat, and fish in these waters, completely unaware that beneath their feet lie the foundations of dreams that were violently cut short. The government called it eminent domain. They called it progress. They called it necessary for the greater good. But what if I told you it was actually something else entirely? What if I told you it was one of the largest, most systematic thefts of black wealth in American history? What if I told you that the very lakes where your family goes to relax were created by drowning the economic futures of thousands of black families? This isn't ancient history, people. Some of the survivors of these drowned towns are still alive today. Some of their children are watching this video right now. And yet, this story, this massive, decades-long pattern of erasure, is barely taught in schools. It's not in your history textbooks. It's not mentioned at the visitor centers of these lakes and parks. Why? Because acknowledging these drowned towns means acknowledging something America would rather forget. It means acknowledging that black Americans didn't fail to build wealth after slavery. Their wealth was stolen. It means acknowledging that the racial wealth gap isn't just about personal choices or cultural differences. It's about systematic destruction of black prosperity. Today, we're going to dive deep, literally and figuratively, into the stories of these submerged communities. We're going to visit the ghost towns that lie beneath some of America's most popular lakes. We're going to meet the families whose ancestors built something beautiful, only to watch it disappear beneath the water. And we're going to confront the uncomfortable truth about what really lies beneath the surface of American history. Because here's what I've learned in researching this story. The water doesn't just hide buildings and streets. It hides the truth. And it's time for that truth to surface. But before we dive in, I need you to do something for me. I need you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because stories like this, stories they don't want you to know, need to reach as many people as possible. And I need you to stick with me for the next 20 minutes, because what you're about to learn will change how you see American history forever. Ready? Let's go underwater. We're starting our journey at Georgia's Lake Lanier, about an hour north of Atlanta. With over 10 million visitors a year, it's one of the most popular recreational lakes in America. Families come here to swim, boat, and escape the summer heat. But Lake Lanier has a darker reputation too. It's known for an unusually high number of drowning deaths and boating accidents. Over 700 people have died in these waters since the lake was created. Local folklore says the lake is cursed, that ghosts pull swimmers down into the depths. People report seeing phantom figures in the water, hearing voices calling from below the surface. But what if I told you those aren't just ghost stories? What if I told you that Lake Lanier really is haunted, not by supernatural spirits, but by the very real ghosts of American injustice? Because before there was Lake Lanier, there was Oscarville, Georgia. And Oscarville was everything white America feared about black prosperity. Picture this. It's 1910, and you're walking down the main street of Oscarville. You see black-owned general stores, a bustling market where black farmers sell their crops, children walking to a school built and funded by the black community itself. You see families who own their land outright, some of it the most valuable lakefront property in North Georgia. Property that today would be worth tens of millions of dollars. Oscarville wasn't an accident. It was built intentionally, strategically, by black families who understood that economic independence was the key to true freedom. Many of the original residents were formerly enslaved people who had worked the very land they now owned. They knew its value, they knew its potential, and they were determined to build something lasting for their children. And they did. By 1912, Oscarville was home to over 1,100 black residents. They had their own businesses, their own social networks, their own systems of mutual support. Children born in Oscarville grew up seeing black success as normal, as expected, as their birthright. But white Georgians saw something different. They saw an uppity black community that didn't know its place. They saw economic competition. They saw black people living better than many whites in the surrounding areas. And they decided it had to stop. The excuse came in September 1912, when a white woman named Ellen Grice was found dead near Lake Lanier, though back then it was just the Chattahoochee River. 3 black men were quickly accused of her murder, though the evidence was flimsy at best. But in the Jim Crow South, evidence didn't matter. Fear mattered. Rage mattered. And the opportunity to destroy black prosperity mattered most of all. What happened next can only be described as racial terrorism. For 3 days, white mobs numbering in the thousands swept through Oscarville like a hurricane of hate. They burned homes, businesses, and churches. They shot at fleeing families. They lynched innocent men from trees that had once shaded thriving, black-owned farms. But here's the part that really shows the calculated nature of this violence. They didn't just attack people. They specifically targeted the symbols and sources of black wealth. They burned the school that represented black education. They destroyed the businesses that represented black economic independence. They forced black landowners to sell their property for pennies on the dollar, or simply took it outright. In those 3 days of terror, over 1,100 black residents were forced from their homes. Families who had spent decades building wealth, accumulating property, creating stability for their children, lost everything. They fled with whatever they could carry, leaving behind not just houses and businesses, but an entire way of life. Think about that for a moment. Think about your own family, your own community, everything you've worked for, everything you've built. Now imagine losing it all in 3 days, not because of a natural disaster or economic collapse, but because your neighbors decided your success was a threat to their sense of racial superiority. The white mobs didn't just drive out the residents. They made sure they could never come back. For decades afterward, black people were banned from even entering Forsyth County, where Oscarville had been located. Signs were posted. "Nigger, don't let the sun go down on you in Forsyth County." It became one of America's most notorious sundown counties, places where black people could literally be killed for being present after dark. But the story doesn't end with the racial cleansing of 1912, because 40 years later, the federal government would finish what the white mobs had started. In the 1950s, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers decided to build Buford Dam on the Chattahoochee River. The purpose was flood control and hydroelectric power, noble goals that would benefit the region's growing population. But where would they put this massive new reservoir? Where would they flood to create the recreational lake that would become Lake Lanier? You already know the answer. They flooded Oscarville. Now, you might say this was just a coincidence. After all, the government needed to flood somewhere, and Oscarville was conveniently located in a river valley. But here's what's not a coincidence. The government made virtually no effort to preserve the history of what they were about to destroy. No archaeological surveys of the black community that had existed there. No compensation to the families who had been driven out 40 years earlier. No acknowledgement that they were about to permanently erase the physical evidence of one of Georgia's most successful black communities. Instead, they simply opened the floodgates. And Oscarville, its foundations, its streets, its remaining buildings, disappeared beneath the rising waters of Lake Lanier. Today, somewhere beneath the pontoon boats and jet skis, lie the concrete foundations of black-owned businesses. Somewhere beneath the swimming areas where children play, rest the remains of a school where black children once learned to read and write. Somewhere beneath the luxury lakefront homes that sell for millions of dollars, lie the property lines of farms that black families once owned outright. The people enjoying Lake Lanier today aren't evil. They're not responsible for what happened to Oscarville. But they are unknowingly participating in the erasure of black history. Because when we use these lakes without acknowledging what lies beneath them, when we enjoy the recreational benefits without recognizing the communities that were destroyed to create them, we become complicit in the covering up of racial injustice. And maybe that's why Lake Lanier has such a dark reputation. Maybe those aren't ghosts pulling swimmers down. Maybe it's the weight of unacknowledged history. Maybe those voices people hear in the water aren't supernatural. Maybe they're the echoes of a community crying out for recognition, for justice, for the simple acknowledgement that they existed, that they mattered, that they built something beautiful before it was stolen from them. But Oscarville isn't the only black community lying beneath America's recreational waters. In fact, it's just the beginning of a pattern that stretches across the entire country, a pattern of systematic destruction disguised as progress. Let's keep going deeper. If you've ever been to Alabama's Lake Martin, you know it's gorgeous. Crystal clear water, perfect for swimming and fishing, surrounded by some of the most expensive lakefront real estate in the South. What you might not know is that you're looking at a watery grave, not just of buildings and streets, but of dreams, ambitions, and the life's work of one remarkable man who refused to accept the limitations that Jim Crow tried to place on him. His name was John Jackson Benson, and he was born into slavery in 1850. But unlike many formerly enslaved people who headed north after emancipation, Benson stayed in Alabama. He had a vision. You see, a vision of what black self-sufficiency could look like in the heart of the South. In the 1880s, Benson did something extraordinary. He purchased 4,000 acres of land along the Tallapoosa River in what would become Elmore County, Alabama. Not just any land, some of the most fertile, valuable riverfront property in the state. And on this land, he didn't just build a farm or a homestead. He built a town, a black town, complete and independent. He called it Kowaliga. Now, understand what this meant in the 1880s South. This was the height of Jim Crow, when black codes were designed to keep black Americans in a state of economic dependence, barely above slavery. When black people were supposed to sharecrop white-owned land, shop at white-owned stores, send their children to underfunded white-controlled schools, if they got any education at all. But Benson had a different idea. He envisioned Kowaliga as a place where black families could live, work, and prosper, completely independent of white control. And incredibly, he made it happen. By 1900, Kowaliga had everything a thriving community needed. Benson built a general store, a grist mill, a cotton gin, and a sawmill. He established a post office and became the town's first postmaster. He built houses and rented them to black families at affordable rates. Most importantly, he brought the railroad to Kowaliga, connecting his community to markets throughout Alabama and beyond. But the crown jewel of Kowaliga was its school. Benson understood that education was the key to maintaining black independence across generations. So he built a school and hired teachers. Black teachers who could provide black children with an education that was not just equal to what white children received, but often superior to it. Think about what this meant for the children growing up in Kowaliga. They walked to school past black-owned businesses. They saw black adults in positions of authority and leadership. They learned from black teachers who weren't constrained by white oversight or Jim Crow limitations on black education. They grew up understanding that black success wasn't an exception. It was the norm. This was revolutionary. This was dangerous. This was exactly the kind of black independence that white supremacy was designed to prevent. And it worked beautifully. For over 40 years. By the 1920s, Kowaliga was home to several hundred residents and was considered one of the most successful black communities in Alabama. Families who had started as sharecroppers were now landowners. Children who might never have learned to read anywhere else were graduating with educations that prepared them for college or professional careers. John Jackson. Benson had proven something that white supremacists insisted was impossible. That black Americans could not only survive without white control, but thrive beyond anything the segregated system would allow. But success, as we've already learned, has a way of making black communities targets. And in 1926, Kowaliga's time ran out. The Alabama Power Company had plans, big plans for hydroelectric development along the Tallapoosa River. They were going to build a massive dam, create a huge reservoir, and generate electricity to power Alabama's growing industrial economy. It was progress, they said. It was economic development. It was for the greater good. And where were they going to put this new reservoir? You already know the answer. When Alabama Power announced their plans for what would become Martin Dam, the entire town of Kowaliga found itself in the flood zone. Every business John Jackson Benson had built, every home where black families had accumulated wealth and stability, the school where black children had learned to see themselves as capable of anything, the railroad depot that had connected this community to the wider world. All of it would be underwater. Now, you might wonder, didn't the residents fight back? Didn't they organize? Didn't they demand fair compensation or alternative locations? Of course they did. This was their life's work, their family's future, their community's legacy. But here's the harsh reality of Jim Crow America. Black communities had no political power. They couldn't vote in meaningful numbers. They had no representation in the state legislature that would approve the dam project. They had no allies in the business community that would profit from the new electricity generation. When Alabama Power came to buy out Kowaliga, they didn't negotiate. They dictated. Fair market value? That was whatever Alabama Power said it was. Alternative locations? None were offered. Compensation for the businesses that would be lost, the community ties that would be severed, the generational wealth that would be destroyed? not considered relevant. John Jackson Benson, now in his 70s, watched as everything he had built over 4 decades was appraised and purchased for a fraction of its true value. The man who had created one of the most successful black communities in the South was forced to sell his life's work to make way for a lake that would primarily benefit white recreational users and white-owned businesses. In 1926, Alabama Power opened the floodgates of Martin Dam, and the waters of the Tallapoosa River began to rise. Slowly, inexorably, Kowaliga disappeared beneath the surface. The businesses that had employed dozens of black workers, the homes where black families had built wealth and stability, the school that had educated hundreds of black children, the railroad depot that had connected black dreams to the wider world. All gone. All underwater. Today, when you're swimming or boating on Lake Martin, you're floating directly above the remains of what may have been Alabama's most successful experiment in black economic independence. Somewhere beneath the luxury lake houses and recreational boats lie the foundations of John Jackson Benson's General Store. Somewhere beneath the swimming areas where children play today rest the classrooms where black children once learned that they could be anything they dreamed of becoming. The irony is stunning. Lake Martin is now surrounded by some of the most expensive real estate in Alabama, the very land that John Jackson Benson and his community once owned and developed. The lakefront property that Benson was forced to sell for pennies in the 1920s is now worth tens of millions of dollars. And the name Kowaliga? It lives on, but not in the way Benson intended. There's a Kowaliga Marina on Lake Martin now, where wealthy boat owners dock their vessels above the drowned dreams of black prosperity. Country music fans might know the name from Hank Williams' song Kowaliga, but they probably don't know it was named after a real place, a real community, a real success story that was deliberately destroyed. John Jackson Benson died in 1932, just 6 years after watching his life's work disappear beneath the water. He never lived to see Lake Martin become a recreational paradise for others. He never saw the millions of dollars in tourism revenue that would flow to the white-owned businesses around the lake he was forced to make possible. But his story, and the story of Kowaliga, reminds us of something crucial. The racial wealth gap in America isn't just about individual choices or cultural differences. It's about what happens when black success is systematically targeted for destruction, when black communities are literally erased from the map in the name of progress. And unfortunately, Kowaliga's story isn't unique. All across America, successful black communities were being wiped off the map, sometimes by flood, sometimes by fire, sometimes by government decree. Each erasure was justified differently, but the result was always the same. Black wealth destroyed, black independence eliminated, black history submerged beneath the waters of American amnesia. Let's surface in New York City, where one of the most shocking erasures happened, right in the heart of Manhattan. Every year, 42 million people visit Central Park in New York City. They picnic on the Great Lawn, row boats on the reservoir, take selfies at Bethesda Fountain. It's one of the most famous parks in the world, a masterpiece of urban planning that provides green space and recreation for millions of New Yorkers. But what if I told you that Central Park was built on top of a thriving black community? What if I told you that beneath your feet, as you walk through this celebrated public space, lie the foundations of what was once one of the most successful black neighborhoods in 19th century America? Because before there was Central Park, there was Seneca Village. And Seneca Village represents something extraordinary in American history. Black land ownership in Manhattan, decades before the Civil War, at a time when most black Americans were still enslaved. Picture this. It's 1825, and you're walking through what is now the area between 82nd and 89th Streets on Manhattan's West Side. You see neat rows of houses with vegetable gardens and small farms. You see black children playing in the streets, attending school, learning to read and write. You see black adults who aren't servants or laborers, but landowners, property taxpayers, voting citizens. Yes, you heard that right. Voting citizens. C. In 1821, New York State had passed a law requiring black men to own $250 worth of property in order to vote, a restriction that didn't apply to white men. It was designed to keep black New Yorkers from participating in democracy. But the residents of Seneca Village turned that racist law into an opportunity. They bought land. They built homes. They accumulated the property wealth necessary to claim their voting rights. By 1855, about 20% of all black voters in New York City lived in Seneca Village, despite being a relatively small community. This wasn't accidental. This was strategic. The founders of Seneca Village understood something that would be proven again and again throughout American history, that land ownership was the foundation of both economic security and political power. If black Americans could own land, they could build wealth. If they could build wealth, they could demand political participation. If they could participate in politics, they could protect their communities from exactly the kind of destruction that would eventually come by the 1850s. Seneca Village was home to about 225 residents, roughly 2/3 of whom were black, with the remainder being Irish and German immigrants. This was remarkable in itself, a genuinely integrated community in pre-Civil War America, where people of different races and ethnicities lived as neighbors and equals. The village had 3 churches, including the All Angels Church, which served the African American Methodist Episcopal congregation. It had a school where black children received an education that was often superior to what was available in other parts of the city. Most importantly, it had a sense of community and mutual support that allowed black families to thrive in ways that were nearly impossible elsewhere in America. But there was something else that made Seneca Village special. It was proof that the racist stereotypes about black Americans were lies. White supremacists claimed that black people were naturally inferior, incapable of self-governance, unable to build or maintain civilized communities. Seneca Village proved them wrong every single day. Here were black families who owned their homes outright, black children who were literate and educated, black adults who participated in civic life, paid taxes, voted in elections, black churches and schools that operated independently of white oversight, a black community that was not just surviving, but thriving in one of America's most expensive and competitive cities. This was dangerous. This was threatening. This was exactly the kind of black success that white supremacy couldn't tolerate. And so, in the 1850s, New York City's white political and business elite came up with a solution. They would create a great public park in the center of Manhattan, they said. A democratic space where all New Yorkers could enjoy nature and recreation. A symbol of the city's commitment to the common good. The only problem was location. Where, in increasingly crowded Manhattan, could they find enough space for such a massive park? Where could they find land that wasn't too expensive, too developed, too politically connected to touch? You know where this is going. In 1853, the New York State Legislature authorized the use of eminent domain to acquire the land that would become Central Park. And Seneca Village, this successful, integrated, politically active community, found itself directly in the path of progress. Now, eminent domain is supposed to serve a legitimate public purpose, and property owners are supposed to receive fair compensation for their losses. But what happened to Seneca Village reveals how these supposedly neutral legal processes can be used as weapons of racial and economic displacement. First, the compensation offered to Seneca Village residents was far below market value. Assessors consistently undervalued black-owned properties, claiming that homes and businesses owned by black families were worth less than identical properties owned by whites. Some families who had invested decades in building their homes and businesses received only a few $100s in compensation. Second, no alternative housing was provided. When white families were displaced by development projects, the city typically helped them relocate to comparable neighborhoods. But Seneca Village residents were simply told to figure it out for themselves. In a city where black families faced severe discrimination in housing markets. Third, the displacement was rushed. Families were given minimal notice to abandon homes and businesses they had spent lifetimes building. Children were forced to leave schools mid-semester. Churches lost not just their buildings, but their congregations, as scattered families could no longer gather in one place. By 1857, it was over. The last residents of Seneca Village had been forced out, and construction of Central Park began. Within a few years, all physical evidence of the community had been erased, homes demolished, streets eliminated. Even the cemetery, where Seneca Village residents had buried their dead, was relocated. But here's what's most infuriating about the destruction of Seneca Village. It wasn't just about making room for a park. It was about eliminating black political power in Manhattan. Remember, Seneca Village residents weren't just landowners. They were voters. They were black citizens who participated in New York city politics at a time when that was extremely rare and politically significant. By destroying their community, the city didn't just displace black families. It disenfranchised black voters. The numbers tell the story. Before the destruction of Seneca Village, Manhattan had a small but significant population of black voters who could influence local elections. After Seneca Village was erased, black political participation in Manhattan dropped dramatically and didn't recover for decades. This wasn't an unintended consequence. It was the point. Today, millions of people enjoy Central Park without knowing that they're walking over the graves of black dreams. The Great Lawn, where families have picnics and children play soccer, sits directly on top of what was once a thriving black neighborhood. The Reservoir, where people jog and take Instagram photos, covers land where black families once owned homes and voted in elections. Occasionally, archaeologists find remnants of Seneca Village, pieces of pottery, foundation stones, personal items that somehow survived the destruction. These artifacts are displayed in museums now, treated as curiosities from a forgotten past. But they're not curiosities. They're evidence of a crime. Because here's what the destruction of Seneca Village really was. It was the use of government power to destroy black wealth, eliminate black political participation, and erase black success from the historical record. It was theft disguised as urban planning. It was racial cleansing disguised as public improvement, and it worked perfectly. For over a century, most New Yorkers had no idea that Central Park was built on top of a black community. The official histories of the park rarely mentioned Seneca Village, and when they did, they described it as a shantytown or slum, racist lies designed to justify its destruction. It wasn't until the 1990s that historians and archaeologists began to uncover and publicize the true story of Seneca Village. And even now, most of the millions of people who visit Central Park each year have no idea what lies beneath their feet. But Central Park isn't the only place where black communities were erased in the name of public improvement. All across America, successful black neighborhoods found themselves in the path of progress. Highways that needed to be built, urban renewal projects that needed land, public works that somehow always seemed to require the destruction of black wealth and black community. Let's head to the Pacific Northwest, where an entire city, Oregon's second largest at the time, was wiped off the map in a single day. Imagine a city of 40,000 people, Oregon's second largest city, disappearing completely in a single day. Not gradually, not over time, but gone, vanished, as if it never existed. It sounds impossible, right? Cities don't just disappear. People don't just lose their homes, their communities, their entire way of life overnight. except sometimes they do. And when it happened in Vanport, Oregon, on May 30th, 1948, it wasn't really an accident. It was the culmination of decades of systematic neglect, deliberate exclusion, and environmental racism that turned a natural disaster into a man-made catastrophe that destroyed the largest black community in Oregon history. But let's start at the beginning, because Vanport's story begins with one of the most remarkable social experiments in American history, and one of the most tragic endings. During World War II, Portland's shipyards were working around the clock to build the Liberty ships that would carry supplies to American forces overseas. The work was dangerous, difficult, and absolutely essential to the war effort. But Portland had a problem. Not enough workers. So the federal government and private contractors did something unprecedented. They actively recruited black workers from the South, promising good jobs, fair wages, and decent housing for their families. For black Americans living under Jim Crow segregation, where economic opportunities were severely limited, this was the chance of a lifetime. They came by the thousands. From Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, entire families packed up their belongings and headed west to Portland, Oregon, to participate in the war effort and build better lives for their children. But here's the thing about Oregon in the 1940s. It was one of the most racist states in America. Oregon's original state constitution had actually banned black people from living in the state at all. Even by the 1940s, Portland had restrictive housing covenants that prohibited black families from buying homes in most neighborhoods. Hotels and restaurants could legally refuse to serve black customers. So where were these thousands of black war workers supposed to live? The answer was Vanport. Built in just 63 days on the Columbia River floodplain, Vanport was designed as temporary wartime housing for defense workers. But it quickly became something much more significant, the most integrated city on the West Coast. Picture this: rows and rows of neat apartment buildings, all identical, all integrated. Black families and white families living next door to each other. Black children and white children attending the same schools, playing in the same playgrounds, growing up as neighbors and friends. In Vanport, a black shipyard worker could live in the same type of apartment, send his kids to the same school, and shop at the same stores as his white coworkers. This was revolutionary. This was everything that segregationists had said was impossible. And it worked beautifully. By 1945, Vanport was home to over 40,000 people, making it Oregon's second largest city after Portland. About 40% of residents were black, making it the largest black community in Oregon history. But it wasn't just the size that made Vanport special. It was the culture. Vanport had jazz clubs where black and white musicians played together. It had community centers where integrated families celebrated holidays and organized events. It had schools where black children could learn alongside white children without the constant reminder of racial hierarchy. For many black families, Vanport represented their first taste of what America could be like without Jim Crow segregation. Children who had grown up in the South under constant threat of racial violence could walk to school safely in Vanport. Parents who had been denied opportunities because of their race could work alongside white colleagues as equals. But there were problems with Vanport, serious structural problems that would prove deadly. First, it was built on a floodplain. The Columbia River had a history of flooding, and Vanport sat in an area that was protected only by a system of dikes and levees. Engineers and city planners knew this was dangerous, but the federal government needed housing fast, and the floodplain was cheap land that nobody else wanted. Second, it was always meant to be temporary. The federal government built Vanport as wartime housing, with the understanding that it would be demolished once the war ended and defense workers moved on. This temporary status meant that infrastructure was built to minimum standards, maintenance was deferred, and long-term safety concerns were ignored. Third, and most importantly, Vanport was expendable. As the war ended and black workers were no longer essential to defense production, white Portland wanted them gone. The integrated community that had been tolerated during wartime was now seen as a threat to Portland's racial order. By 1948, white civic leaders in Portland were actively working to eliminate Vanport. They couldn't just kick out the residents. That would be too obviously racist and might cause political problems. But they could make sure that when disaster struck, Vanport wasn't protected. And disaster was coming. In May 1948, unusually heavy snowmelt in the Columbia River watershed caused water levels to rise dramatically. The dikes protecting Vanport were straining under the pressure. Engineers could see that the situation was becoming dangerous. But here's where the story becomes not just tragic, but criminal. Vanport residents weren't warned. On the morning of May 30th, 1948, officials knew that the dikes were failing. They knew that Vanport was in imminent danger of catastrophic flooding. They knew that 40,000 people needed to evacuate immediately. But instead of sounding evacuation alarms, instead of mobilizing emergency services, instead of doing everything possible to save lives, officials made a different choice. They told Vanport residents that everything was fine. They assured them that the dikes would hold. They actively discouraged people from leaving. Why? Because they were afraid that if Vanport residents evacuated to Portland, they might never leave. They were more concerned about maintaining racial segregation than about saving black lives. At 4:05 p.m. on May 30th, 1948, the railroad dike collapsed. The Columbia River roared into Vanport like a tsunami, destroying everything in its path. In less than a day, Oregon's second-largest city was completely underwater. Miraculously, only 15 people died in the flood, a testament to the courage and quick thinking of residents, who saved each other despite the official negligence that had put them in danger. But the human cost was much greater than the death toll. 40,000 people lost their homes. Families lost everything they owned: furniture, photographs, keepsakes, the material accumulation of years of hard work. Children lost their schools, their friends, their sense of home and community. But most devastating of all, they lost Vanport itself, the one place on the West Coast where integrated living had actually worked, where black and white families had proven that racial harmony was possible, where children had grown up believing that America might actually live up to its promises of equality and justice. In the aftermath of the flood, Vanport residents found themselves scattered across the region, many of them homeless, most of them unwelcome in Portland's segregated neighborhoods. The integrated community that had thrived during the war years was gone, forever. And Portland made sure it stayed gone. Instead of rebuilding Vanport, instead of creating new integrated housing for the displaced families, Portland officials saw the flood as an opportunity. They could finally solve what they had called the Vanport problem, the presence of thousands of black families in the Portland metropolitan area, some displaced. Residents were given minimal assistance to leave Oregon entirely. Others were crowded into a small area of North Portland that became a segregated black ghetto. The integrated schools, the jazz clubs, the community centers, the neighborhood networks that had made Vanport special, none of that was rebuilt. Today, if you drive through the area where Vanport once stood, you'll see industrial facilities, parking lots, and empty fields. There's a small historical marker, easy to miss, that acknowledges that a city of 40,000 people once existed there. But there's no monument to the integrated community that worked. No memorial to the dreams that were washed away. No acknowledgement of the systematic racism that turned a natural disaster into a social catastrophe. The destruction of Vanport wasn't just about housing or urban planning. It was about the limits of American tolerance for racial integration. As long as black workers were needed for the war effort, integrated housing was acceptable. But once that need ended, the integrated community had to go. The flood of 1948 didn't destroy Vanport. Racism destroyed Vanport. The flood just provided the excuse, and that's a pattern we see again and again in American history. Natural disasters that become social. Disasters because of deliberate decisions about who deserves protection and who doesn't. Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Urban renewal in countless cities. And yes, the flooding of black communities to create recreational lakes for white families. But Vanport's story reminds us of something else too, that integration can work. That black and white families can live together as neighbors and equals. That children can grow up without racial hatred if adults create communities based on fairness and mutual respect. The tragedy isn't just that Vanport was destroyed. The tragedy is that America chose not to rebuild it. Let's continue our journey into the drowned towns of America. Because there are more communities beneath the water, more stories that have been deliberately submerged and forgotten. By now, you might be thinking that the stories I've been telling are isolated incidents. Tragic, yes, but not necessarily connected to a larger pattern of systematic destruction. Maybe Oscarville was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe Kowaliga was simply an unfortunate casualty of necessary infrastructure development. Maybe Seneca Village was just unlucky to be in the path of urban progress. But what if I told you that these weren't isolated incidents at all? What if I told you that all across America, dozens of communities, disproportionately black and poor communities, were being systematically targeted for submersion beneath federal dam projects? What if I told you that the pattern is so consistent, so widespread, that it can only be understood as deliberate policy? Let me introduce you to two more communities that disappeared beneath the waters of American progress. Butler, Tennessee, and St. Thomas, Nevada. Their stories reveal how the federal government's dam-building boom of the mid-20th century became one of the largest programs of community destruction in American history. Butler, Tennessee. Death of an Appalachian community nestled in the mountains of East Tennessee. Butler was everything that small-town America is supposed to represent. Founded in the 1890s, it was home to about 700 people who had built their lives around farming, logging, and the tight-knit community bonds that develop in isolated mountain towns. Butler wasn't a wealthy place. This was Appalachian Tennessee, where most families lived modestly but independently. But it was a real community, with deep roots and strong connections between neighbors who had known each other for generations. The people of Butler had survived the Great Depression by helping each other through the hardest times. They had sent their sons to fight in World War II and welcomed them home as heroes. They had built churches and schools with their own hands, creating institutions that reflected their values and served their children. Most importantly, they owned their land. In a region where many people were trapped in cycles of economic dependence, Butler residents had achieved something precious: independence. They might not have had much money, but they had homes they owned outright, farms that fed their families, and a community that belonged to them. Then, in the 1940s, the Tennessee Valley Authority came calling. The TVA had big plans for the region. They were going to build Watauga Dam on the Watauga River, creating a massive reservoir that would generate electricity and provide flood control for the Tennessee Valley. It was all part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal vision of using federal power to modernize the South and Appalachia. But where would they put this new reservoir? Where would they flood to create the lake that would power Tennessee's industrial development? Butler, Tennessee, found itself directly in the flood zone. Now, you might think that the federal government would work with Butler residents to find solutions. Maybe relocate the town to higher ground. Maybe redesign the dam to minimize community displacement. Maybe provide generous compensation and assistance with relocation. You'd be wrong. The TVA approached Butler with the cold efficiency of a government agency that saw communities as obstacles to be removed rather than people to be served. Residents were told their town would be flooded, their property would be purchased at government-appraised values, and they had no choice in the matter. Fair market value? The government would decide what that was. Alternative locations? Not the government's problem. Compensation for the loss of community ties, family graves, generations of local history? Not considered relevant. The people of Butler tried to fight back. They organized community meetings, petitioned their representatives, hired lawyers to challenge the condemnation proceedings. But they were up against the full power of the federal government during the height of the New Deal, when challenging federal development projects was considered unpatriotic. One by one, Butler families were forced to sell their homes and leave the only place many of them had ever known. The process was devastating not just economically, but psychologically and socially. Imagine losing not just your house, but your church, your school, your post office, your general store, all the places that made your community a community. In 1948, the TVA opened the floodgates of Watauga Dam, and Butler, Tennessee, disappeared beneath the rising waters. The town square where generations had gathered. The school where children had learned to read. The churches where families had worshipped for decades. The cemetery where their ancestors were buried, all underwater. Today, Watauga Lake is a popular recreational destination. Tourists come to fish, boat, and enjoy the mountain scenery. They have no idea that they're floating above the remains of a Ba community that fought desperately to survive. There's a new Butler now, built on higher ground to relocate some of the displaced families. But anyone who has lived through community displacement will tell you, you can't just recreate a community by building new buildings. The social bonds, the shared history, the sense of place that develops over generations, once that's destroyed, it can never be fully restored. St. Thomas, Nevada, drowned by the desert's greatest dam. Now let's travel west to the desert between Nevada and Arizona, where one of America's most famous engineering projects created one of its most famous lakes and erased another community from the map. St. Thomas, Nevada, was founded in 1865 by Mormon pioneers who had been sent south from Salt Lake City to establish farming communities in the desert. It was hard country, scorching hot in summer, isolated from major population centers, dependent on the Colorado River for irrigation and survival. But the people of St. Thomas made it work. By the 1920s, the town had grown to about 500 residents who had built a thriving agricultural community in one of America's harshest environments. They had farms that produced cotton, alfalfa, and vegetables. They had a railroad depot that connected them to markets in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. They had schools, churches, and businesses that served not just St. Thomas, but the entire surrounding region. What made St. Thomas special wasn't just its survival in the desert, it was its diversity. Unlike many Western towns of that era, St. Thomas was genuinely multicultural. Mormon families worked alongside Mexican-American farmers. Native American workers were employed in local businesses. The harsh desert environment had a way of breaking down social barriers. Because survival required cooperation across racial and ethnic lines, St. Thomas residents had built something remarkable, a functioning, diverse community in one of the most challenging environments in North America. But St. Thomas had one major problem. It sat on the Colorado River, in exactly the spot where the federal government wanted to build the most ambitious dam project in American history. The Boulder Canyon Project, which would create what we now know as Hoover Dam and Lake Mead, was designed to tame the Colorado River, provide water for California's growing cities, and generate electricity for the entire Southwest. It was one of the engineering marvels of the 20th century, a symbol of American ingenuity and federal power. And St. Thomas was directly in the Comey way. Unlike some of the communities we've discussed, St. Thomas residents knew what was coming well in advance. The Boulder Canyon project was approved by Congress in 1928, and construction of Hoover Dam began in 1931. St. Thomas wouldn't be flooded until the reservoir filled, which would take several years after the dam's completion. This advance notice created a strange and heartbreaking situation. St. Thomas residents had to watch their community die slowly. Year by year, as families moved away, businesses closed, and the town gradually emptied in anticipation of its own destruction. Some families left immediately, unwilling to watch their community's death throes. Others stayed until the very end, determined to preserve St. Thomas for as long as possible. A few hardy souls remained, even as the Colorado River began backing up behind the newly completed dam. Living in a ghost town that was slowly being surrounded by rising water, that the last residents of St. Thomas didn't leave until 1938, when the rising waters of Lake Mead finally reached their doorsteps. They loaded their belongings onto boats and trucks, took one last look at the town their families had built in the desert, and watched it disappear beneath the largest artificial lake in America. The pattern becomes clear now. Here's what connects Butler, Tennessee, and St. Thomas, Nevada, to Oscarville, Kowaliga, Seneca Village, and Vanport. They were all expendable. When federal agencies needed land for dams, reservoirs, and hydroelectric projects, they didn't target wealthy white suburbs or politically powerful communities. They targeted places like rural Tennessee mountain towns, isolated desert communities, and especially black neighborhoods that had no political voice and few resources to fight back. This wasn't accidental. Federal agencies conducted studies to identify the least resistant communities, places where land could be acquired cheaply and opposition could be minimized. Time and again, these studies identified the same types of communities: poor, rural, minority, politically powerless. The result was one of the largest programs of community destruction in American history, carried out under the banner of progress and modernization. Between 1930 and 1970, federal dam projects displaced over 400,000 people from their homes and communities. Hundreds of towns and neighborhoods were permanently erased from the map, and the pattern was always the same. Communities that took generations to build were destroyed in months or years. Residents received minimal compensation for properties that had been their family's primary source of wealth. No equivalent communities were created to replace what was lost. The social, cultural, and economic networks that had sustained these places for decades were simply eliminated. But here's what makes this pattern particularly insidious. It was justified by appeals to the greater good. These dam projects would provide electricity for growing cities, flood control for agricultural regions, recreation opportunities for American families. The destruction of individual communities was presented as a necessary sacrifice for national progress. Except the benefits of this progress were not equally shared. The electricity generated by these dams primarily served urban areas and industrial development. The recreational lakes created by flooding rural communities became vacation destinations for middle-class and wealthy families. The flood control provided by these reservoirs protected downstream communities that were predominantly white and politically powerful. Meanwhile, the people who lost their homes and communities, disproportionately poor, rural, and minority families, received few, if any, of these benefits. They were sacrificed for a version of progress that excluded them from its rewards. Today, millions of Americans enjoy the lakes created by these federal dam projects without knowing what lies beneath the water. They swim and boat above the foundations of churches and schools. They fish above the graves of communities that once thrived. They take family vacations at recreational facilities built on the systematic destruction of other families' homes and histories. This isn't their fault. Most people simply don't know this history. But it is our collective responsibility to acknowledge it. to understand how the recreational spaces we enjoy were created, and to recognize the full human cost of the progress we celebrate. Because understanding this pattern, this systematic targeting of vulnerable communities for destruction in the name of progress, helps us see that what happened to these drowned towns wasn't just about individual tragedies or unfortunate necessities. It was about power, privilege, and the decision that some communities matter more than others. And that pattern didn't end with dam projects in the mid-20th century. It continues today in new forms, with new justifications, but the same underlying logic, that progress for some requires the destruction of others, and that certain communities are expendable in service to a greater good that never seems to include them. We've traveled across America together, from Georgia's Lake Lanier to Oregon's Vanport, from Manhattan's Central Park to Tennessee's Watauga Lake. We've seen thriving communities disappear beneath the water, successful black neighborhoods erased from the map, generations of accumulated wealth stolen in the name of progress. But now I need you to step back with me and see the bigger picture. Because what happened to these communities wasn't a series of unfortunate coincidences or isolated tragedies. It was part of a systematic, deliberate, decades-long campaign to prevent Black Americans from building and maintaining generational wealth. And understanding this campaign, recognizing it for what it really was, is crucial for understanding America today. It's crucial for understanding the racial wealth gap, the ongoing debates about reparations, and the persistent patterns of inequality that shape American society in the 21st century. The anatomy of systematic wealth destruction. Let's start with some numbers, because the scale of what we're talking about is staggering. Between 1865 and 1965, the century following the end of slavery, historians estimate that Black Americans lost the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars in today's money through systematic wealth destruction. This includes property stolen during racial massacres, businesses destroyed by white mobs, land taken through fraudulent legal processes, and yes, entire communities erased by government projects. But it's not just about the immediate theft. It's about the compounding effect over generations. When John Jackson Benson built Kowaliga in the 1880s, he wasn't just creating a town. He was creating generational wealth for dozens of Black families. Children who grew up in Kowaliga would have inherited property, business connections, and educational opportunities that could have been passed down to their children and grandchildren. When that community was flooded in 1926, it didn't just destroy the buildings and businesses that existed at that moment. It destroyed the future, the accumulated wealth that would have grown over the next century, the business networks that would have created opportunities for subsequent generations, the educational and social capital that would have benefited thousands of descendants. Multiply that pattern across hundreds of communities, and you begin to understand the true scale of the theft. We're not just talking about the loss of individual properties or businesses. We're talking about the systematic prevention of Black wealth accumulation on a massive scale. The mechanics of legalized theft. What makes this campaign of wealth destruction particularly insidious is that it was largely legal. It was carried out through official government processes, justified by legitimate-sounding purposes, and implemented by respected institutions. Eminent domain laws that were supposed to serve the public good were used disproportionately against Black communities. Urban renewal programs that were supposed to eliminate slums targeted thriving Black neighborhoods for destruction. Highway construction projects that were supposed to improve transportation somehow always seemed to require bulldozing Black business districts. Environmental projects like the dam construction that destroyed so many communities were presented as scientific, neutral, objective improvements that would benefit everyone. But the choice of where to locate these projects, whose communities to flood, whose neighborhoods to eliminate, those choices were never neutral. The pattern was always the same. Identify a legitimate public purpose, then choose to pursue that purpose in ways that destroyed black wealth while preserving white wealth. Build the highway through the black neighborhood instead of the white one. Flood the black town instead of relocating the dam. Create the park on top of the black community instead of finding alternative land. Each individual decision could be justified on technical or economic grounds. But taken together, they reveal a systematic targeting of black communities for sacrifice in service of broader public goals. A myth of black economic failure. Understanding this history is crucial because it demolishes one of the most persistent and damaging myths in American society. The myth that black Americans have failed to build wealth because of personal or cultural deficiencies. The communities we've explored today, Oscarville, Kowaliga, Seneca Village, Vanport, prove that black Americans didn't fail to build wealth after slavery. They succeeded brilliantly, repeatedly, despite facing enormous obstacles and systematic discrimination. Black Americans created thriving businesses when they were legally excluded from white-owned establishments. They built excellent schools when they were denied access to white educational institutions. They accumulated valuable property when they were banned from living in white neighborhoods. They developed sophisticated financial and social networks when they were excluded from white banks and organizations. The problem wasn't black inability to create wealth. The problem was white America's systematic destruction of black wealth whenever it became too successful, too independent, too threatening to racial hierarchies. Every time black communities achieved economic independence, every time they proved that black Americans could prosper without white control, those communities were targeted for destruction. Sometimes through private violence, sometimes through government action, but always with the same result. Black wealth destroyed, black independence eliminated, black success erased from memory. The intergenerational impact, but the damage didn't stop with the immediate theft. It compounded across generations in ways that continue to shape American society today. Think about it this way. When a white family's property appreciates in value over decades, that wealth gets passed down to their children and grandchildren. It becomes the down payment for the next generation's home, the startup capital for a family business, the college fund that ensures educational opportunities. But when black families' property is stolen, whether through racial violence, government seizure, or systematic exclusion from appreciating neighborhoods, that wealth transfer is broken. The next generation starts from zero instead of building on their parents' achievements. Multiply that pattern across millions of families and hundreds of communities, and you get exactly what we see in America today. A massive racial wealth gap that can't be explained by individual choices or cultural differences, but only by systematic wealth destruction over generations. Median white family today has about 10 times the wealth of the median black family. That's not because white families are 10 times more hardworking, or 10 times smarter, or 10 times more virtuous. It's because white families have been allowed to accumulate and transfer wealth across generations, while black families have repeatedly had their wealth destroyed just as it began to accumulate. The intergenerational impact, but the damage didn't stop with the immediate theft. It compounded across generations in ways that continue to shape American society today. Think about it this way. When a white family's property appreciates in value over decades, that wealth gets passed down to their children and grandchildren. It becomes the down payment for the next generation's home, the startup capital for a family business, the college fund that ensures educational opportunities. But when black families' property is stolen, whether through racial violence, government seizure, or systematic exclusion from appreciating neighborhoods, that wealth transfer is broken. The next generation starts from zero instead of building on their parents' achievements. Multiply that pattern across millions of families and hundreds of communities, and you get exactly what we see in America today. A massive racial wealth gap that can't be explained by individual choices or cultural differences, but only by systematic wealth destruction over generations. Median white family today has about 10 times the wealth of the median black family. That's not because white families are 10 times more hardworking, or 10 times smarter, or 10 times more virtuous. It's because white families have been allowed to accumulate and transfer wealth across generations, while black families have repeatedly had their wealth destroyed just as it began to accumulate. Modern echoes of historical patterns. And here's what's most disturbing. These patterns didn't end with the civil rights era. They continue today in new forms, with new justifications. But the same underlying logic. When successful black neighborhoods are targeted for gentrification, and long-term black residents are displaced by rising rents and property taxes, that's the same pattern we've seen throughout American history. Black communities destroyed in the name of improvement that primarily benefits white newcomers. When toxic waste facilities and polluting industries are disproportionately located in black and brown communities. That's environmental racism using the same logic that decided black communities were expendable when dams needed to be built. When black children are pushed out of improving schools through disciplinary policies and charter school expansion. That's educational apartheid using the same mechanisms of exclusion that prevented black communities from accessing quality education in previous eras. The methods have become more subtle, the justifications more sophisticated, but the pattern remains: systematic policies that prevent black wealth accumulation while appearing race-neutral on the surface. The reparations connection. This is why the conversation about reparations isn't just about slavery. It's about the century of systematic wealth destruction that followed slavery, the ongoing policies that perpetuate racial inequality, and the recognition that the racial wealth gap is not a natural phenomenon, but the result of deliberate policy choices. Reparations advocates aren't asking for charity or handouts. They're demanding recognition of a debt that accumulates interest every year that it goes unpaid, every generation that starts behind, because of wealth that was stolen from their ancestors. When we understand that successful black communities like Oscarville and Kowaliga weren't just destroyed, but were specifically targeted for destruction. When we recognize that black wealth wasn't absent, but was systematically stolen, then reparations becomes not a matter of social policy, but a matter of justice. Imagine what America would look like today if Seneca Village had been allowed to thrive in Manhattan, if Oscarville had been permitted to develop into a major lakefront community, if Kowaliga had grown into a significant economic center, if Vanport had been rebuilt as an integrated city. Imagine the black-owned businesses that would exist today, the generational wealth that would have accumulated, the educational and professional opportunities that would have developed, the political power that would have been built. That's not speculation. That's what was stolen. That's what reparations would begin to address. The ongoing erasure of black history. But there's another dimension to this systematic destruction that we need to acknowledge. The deliberate erasure of these stories from American memory. How many Americans learn about Seneca Village in school? How many know that successful black towns were drowned beneath their favorite lakes? How many understand that the racial wealth gap is rooted in systematic theft rather than individual failure? The answer is almost none. These stories have been systematically excluded from American history curricula, from tourism materials, from the narratives we tell ourselves about progress and development. And that erasure isn't accidental. It's the final step in the theft, not just stealing black wealth, but stealing the memory of black wealth, so that each generation of black Americans grows up believing their ancestors never had anything to lose. Today, we're seeing new attempts to erase black history from schools, to ban books that tell uncomfortable truths about American racism, to restrict curricula that might make white students feel bad about their ancestors' actions. But here's what those who want to erase this history don't understand. We're not teaching about systematic racism to make anyone feel guilty. We're teaching about it because understanding the past is essential for creating a more just future. Breaking the cycle. Because here's the thing about systematic problems. They require systematic solutions. Individual success stories are important and inspiring, but they don't solve systematic problems. When the system is designed to prevent black wealth accumulation, we need to change the system, not just celebrate the individuals who manage to succeed despite it. That means policies that actively address historical theft through reparations programs. It means investments in black communities that have been systematically disinvested in for generations. It means educational curricula that tell the full truth about American history. It means land use and development policies that protect communities instead of displacing them. But it also means something more fundamental. It means recognizing that American prosperity has never been colorblind, that our recreational lakes and parks and highways were often built on the systematic destruction of black communities, and that enjoying the benefits of that development comes with the responsibility to acknowledge its costs. The moral reckoning. Every time you visit Central Park, remember Seneca Village. Every time you boat on Lake Lanier, remember Oscarville. Every time you vacation at any of America's artificial lakes, ask yourself, whose community lies beneath these waters? This isn't about guilt or shame. It's about recognition and responsibility. Recognition of what was lost, responsibility for what comes next. Because the families who built Oscarville and Kowaliga and Seneca Village, they weren't asking for special treatment. They were asking for the same opportunity that white families had, the chance to build wealth, raise their children in safety, and pass something valuable to the next generation. They proved it was possible. They showed that black Americans could create prosperity and independence when given the chance. And America responded by drowning their dreams beneath the waters of progress. But those dreams don't have to stay drowned. Those communities don't have to remain forgotten. And the patterns that destroyed them don't have to continue shaping American society. The water may have covered the buildings, but it can't erase the truth. And the truth, once it surfaces, has the power to change everything. These towns weren't just lost, they were stolen. Today, we've traveled through the hidden geography of American injustice. We've walked the streets of Oscarville before they were drowned beneath Lake Lanier's recreational waters. We visited the businesses and schools of Kowaliga before Alabama Power decided they were less important than hydroelectric development. We've seen the integrated community of Vanport before Portland's racist officials chose to let it wash away rather than protect black lives. We've witnessed the systematic destruction of black wealth disguised as progress, the deliberate erasure of black success presented as neutral policy, the theft of generational prosperity justified as the greater good. But we've also seen something else, the incredible resilience, creativity, and determination of black Americans who refused to accept the limitations that white supremacy tried to impose on them. Every community we've explored today began with formerly enslaved people who had every reason to give up, who had every excuse to accept poverty and marginalization as their permanent condition. Instead, they built something beautiful. They created wealth where none had existed. They established schools where their children could learn. They opened businesses where black families could prosper. They proved again and again that black Americans weren't the problem. Racism was the problem, and their descendants are still proving it today. In cities and towns across America, black communities continue to build wealth, create institutions, and fight for justice despite ongoing systematic barriers. The entrepreneurial spirit that built Kowaliga lives on in today's black-owned businesses. The educational vision that created Seneca Village's schools continues in today's black educators and students. The integrated community that thrived in Vanport inspires today's movements for racial justice and equality. But here's what we can't let happen. We can't let these stories disappear again beneath the waters of American amnesia. Because every time we forget this history, Every time we allow it to be erased from textbooks and curricula, every time we pretend that the racial wealth gap is about individual choices, rather than systematic theft, we become complicit in the ongoing injustice. Children growing up today, black children and white children, Latino children and Asian children and Native American children, they all deserve to know the truth about American history. They deserve to understand that black Americans didn't fail to build wealth after slavery. Their wealth was stolen. They deserve to know that the parks and lakes and recreational facilities they enjoy were often created by destroying black communities. They deserve to learn that American prosperity has never been colorblind, and that creating a more just society requires acknowledging and addressing historical injustices. This isn't about making anyone feel guilty about the past. It's about empowering everyone to create a better future. Because here's what gives me hope. Every time these stories are told, every time someone learns about Oscarville or Kowaliga or Seneca Village for the first time, something changes. Understanding changes. Empathy develops. The mythology of American innocence gives way to a more complex, more honest, more useful understanding of how we got where we are and where we need to go. Your role in this story, and that's where you come in. Because this isn't just history. It's a call to action. Share this video. Not just because it's interesting or shocking, but because these stories need to reach people who have never heard them before. Every share, every conversation this video sparks, every person who learns something new about American history. That's how change happens. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this, stories they don't teach in school, stories that make people uncomfortable, stories that challenge the narratives we've been told about American progress, these stories need to be told again and again until they can no longer be ignored. But don't just consume this content, act on it. When you visit recreational lakes and parks, ask about their history. When you see historical markers that seem incomplete or sanitized, ask what's missing from the story. When you encounter discussions about the racial wealth gap or reparations, share what you've learned about systematic wealth destruction. Support organizations working to preserve and share Black history. Advocate for more complete and honest curricula in your local schools. Use your voice and your vote to support policies that address historical injustices instead of perpetuating them. The water is rising, because here's the thing about truth. It has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's been buried. The waters that covered Oscarville and Kowaliga and all the other drowned towns of America, they were meant to hide the evidence, to erase the memory, to make it seem like these communities never existed at all. But water is not permanent. Droughts reveal the foundations of submerged buildings. Falling lake levels expose the streets of drowned towns. And changing consciousness brings buried histories back to the surface, where they can no longer be ignored. The truth about America's drowned towns is rising. The question is, will you help it break the surface, or will you let it sink back into the depths of forgotten history? Remember, these communities weren't just lost, they were stolen. Remembering is the first step toward justice. And justice, like truth, has a way of surfacing when we least expect it and most need it. The water can drown buildings, but it can't drown the truth forever. And the truth is ready to breathe again.